yeah, you really helped me clarify when I was looking into classical education and just being like, okay, how does this all fit together?
So, classical education has its roots in ancient Greece, and it's been happening ever since. That means you're going to have people who agree and disagree, and they fight, and they don't like how this one assesses, and that can get really confusing. But overall, there are characteristics to classical education that you should be looking for. What is a person? How are we formed? And to what end ought we aim? Classically, the telos of your education should match the telos of your personhood. And that is ultimately, we hope for our children, communion with God. That's why they exist.
Howdy, folks. Welcome back to the podcast. I am currently still reveling. Is that a word?
Yeah.
Reveling in the podcast that we just concluded with Kern from thecommonplace.com or from her YouTube channel, The Commonplace. I tell you what, she's got a podcast, The Commonplace. I'm so fired up right now because of the way that Autumn talks about life, the way she approaches life. I'll be the first to admit. Okay, you ready, Katie? I'm going to admit this. And then we're going to get rolling. I thought this was going to be like one of those like homeschool podcasts that I didn't care about, where I was like, okay, here's another homeschool conversation. This was a life conversation. Her philosophy and her principles for life are so empowering. I'm so grateful I was a part of this conversation, being the head of our home, being, the father of my children, the husband to Katie. It's like, this is so rich and so valuable. So Autumn Kern, you can find her at thecommonplacepodcast.com or just thecommonplace.com. She's got content on YouTube, which is extremely inspirational. She speaks to, classical education, particularly Charlotte Mason style education. And it got me fired up. We do want to tell you too, I know we mentioned this last week, but we have a new principle that we're actually pretty excited about. Katie, can you share about this new principle?
Well, yeah, it's not just a new printable because it is a printable, but it's also an hour-long webinar or masterclass or whatever. And I hate to use those terms because we actually don't sell you anything in it. Usually our masterclasses or our webinars, we load the value up front and we also pitch you on a product. But this was just something we felt very passionately about and have no product for. So don't be excited. We don't have anything for this masterclass at the end. We just kind of dump you off and say, hey, I hope that was encouraging. Here's a printable. Hopefully it's applicable to you in your own home. So it is a masterclass all about creating family culture in your home. And we just basically talk through the different principles that we experienced growing up and then the principles that we're enacting in our own home when it comes to family culture, starting from the basics and then just getting very, very granular and practical. So I guess we're just staying on the basics the whole time.
Yeah.
We're going from the basics to practical. So have fun with that.
Well, we give some big picture concepts. Yeah.
But I do think that often when we address this, we have this big vision of, we want this family culture and we want our kids to love coming home and we want, to have this vibrant marriage and all these things. And then we're like, so what do we do? Mm-hmm. And it can be really hard if maybe we've never seen it enacted or we don't have anyone around us who's living that way. And so we hope that this encourages you guys. You can find it at the link in the description along with where you can find Autumn Kern.
The Now That We're a Family podcast.
Well, Autumn, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. You're a name that has come up really for probably the last year and a half, especially since Katie started showing more interest in, classical education and Charlotte Mason education. We both became a lot more passionate about literature over the last couple of years. And I mean, I'm just inspired looking at the bookshelf behind you to start with, and we haven't even heard from you yet, and I'm already getting inspired. Our audience, a lot of them know who you are, they know a bit about you, but for those that don't know you, I'm curious, in your own words, who are you? What do you do? Are you married? Do you have children? What's your life like right now?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you both. My name is Autumn Kern, and I am usually having the most fun, is how I think about my life. So I'm the lady who gets to be involved with a lot of great things. I'm married to my husband, Josh. We've been married for almost 11 years, and we have 3 young children. Our oldest is 7, our girl, and then we have 2 boys, 5.5 and 3.5. So our house is lively. It's very convivial. We're very much in the early stages of a lot of things, but everything kind of centers here in this place. My husband and I are both entrepreneurs, so we work from home, we school at home, and we just do a lot of things in our house. We love being together. We love building hopefully life-giving habits and rhythms and ideas that will continue to bless our kids, but also the world around us. And that's kind of important to me in this season of life. And so my husband was actually the homeschooled person out of the two of us. And my mother-in-law deserves all the credit for being one of those 90s moms who were trusting God and her gut. Like there was no internet, there was no searching for these things. And she was determined to homeschool my in-laws, including my husband, which I think your moms were both kind of in that renegade group too, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. Before it was cool and before they had a lot of research, it was just like on a hope and a prayer.
Right. My mother-in-law remembers the pink books as being like the Charlotte Mason books. When I started to get into homeschooling, we started chatting, and it's just so fun to hear about what it was like for her to find these ideas and curriculum options, and then what my husband experienced. But all that to say, it was Josh who told me when we were first getting to know one another that the woman he married would be homeschooling his children. And I am a public school kid. And so to me, I heard that and thought, well, you are mighty handsome, so we will put a pin in it and see how this goes. And by the time I got to know his family and just fell in love with them and so much of their family culture and togetherness, that I was like, okay, it's got to be the homeschooling. Like, this is how this happened for you guys. And so when we were expecting our oldest, who is 7 now, so it was about 8 years ago, I thought, well, I should figure out how you homeschool, because I loved school growing up. And I kind of thought, well, I just do school at home. Like, that must be homeschooling. And I did the Google. It's a very overwhelming Google search, how to homeschool. But during that, I fell through what I now call the classical wardrobe and to something called classical education. And if you are familiar with Lewis, which I know you guys have talked about his books when you kind of do your book recap videos and conversations, he has the Chronicles of Narnia. And if you have gone through the wardrobe with Lucy Pevensey, you know you are not the same. You cannot be the same once you go through. You do not ever come back the same. And that has been classical education for me. I fell into this world of truth, goodness, and beauty that came with ideas and practices that form the whole person. And I fell in love. It's become my thing. So when I thought homeschooling would just be this thing I did, it's become so much more because it touches every part of our life. And so from that, and this season of life, what I'm doing right now, it's spilled out of our house and into a project called the Commonplace. And that's kind of my fun margin thing where I teach other women educational philosophy so they can be really strong, awesome mother teachers in their own home. Because I truly believe that if you inspire a mom, if you captivate a mom's imagination, you change an entire house. And there's so much power in being the lady of the house. And so I'm the lady having the most fun generally, no matter what we're doing.
What an inspirational bio.
Yeah.
Like seriously, this is why I listen to you.
Yeah.
Because I'm just always, you have the same effect on me when I listen to you that I do when I read Charlotte Mason. And that is, you just feel this elevation. Truly, like you feel like you're elevated, you're getting called up. Just the language with which you speak makes you want to be better. You know, I don't have the right language for it, but it's very, very inspirational.
Yeah. I mean, I tell you what, that was inspiring to hear. I kind of got goosebumps. And you talked about the power of being the woman of the house and how when the woman of the house can catch a vision of what's the three, the truth, beauty, and truth, goodness, and beauty. I was like, that is powerful. And then in addition to that, you talked about like the application of this as well. These aren't just ideals and philosophies. There is practical application that you see on a day-to-day basis. Like the home is changed in a very tangible way. And I love hearing that in your language. And the fact that you even have a vernacular around this philosophy, I think is powerful. You talked about culture in a home. I think language is such a powerful thing in a home. It's necessary. Like you're going to have, coined terms in your home, whether you're intentional about it or not. But just the fact that you said like, oh, you went through the wardrobe, like everybody knows what you're talking about right there. And there's a feeling or an idea associated with that picture. And that's really exciting. I just can't wait to dig into more of this. I want to ask real quickly though, backing up, because you speak with so much clarity around this topic. Did you have a love of literature growing up? You said that your educational background sounds like it was a bit more traditional public school. Did you have this, what was that journey like in getting a love for literature, reading C.S. Lewis, discovering Charlotte Mason? Were you looking for that, or were you genuinely open-minded, thinking it was going to be a lot more conventional? And then, as you said, you kind of stumbled into this. What was that, your background leading to this love for it?
Yeah, great question. So I have a slightly an odd background for being in this world, the homeschooling Christian classical world. I did not grow up in a Christian home, and I grew up going to public school. And so a lot of my personal background, I kind of refer to as just a bleak house, which is a play on a Dickens title. My I had a lot of addiction and different things in my home. And so actually story became the way in which I saw outside of my own home. And so a lot of people fall in love with stories when they're a kid because they do take you to other places that help reflect back into your world and make sense of it. And for a lot of kids, it's from a healthy place, right? Like that's what we're probably all trying to do for our kids, give them rich literature that builds out a world that helps them see that God's grace is infused in all things and that they can be the one who's brave. They might struggle, but that's part of it. That's what we're hoping is the healthy form. But what I had was more, I can't make sense of this darkness that I'm growing up in, and I don't really know from which way to go or to look to. And stories became these glimpses of, oh, life could be lovely, or even there is delight and there is goodness when you are struggling. And that's, of course, in a lot of our classic literature picks for kids, the hopeful thing. These kids struggle. They go through real things. Parents die, they're sent away, they don't have what they need. These are the types of stories we give our kids, and yet help comes. And I love fairy tales in particular, I always have, because the help comes from the wild, just outside of what you can reason and understand. And so even though I wasn't in a Christian home, this soil was growing for the idea of something otherly, something beyond people and what I could see. And so I didn't have language for that as a child, of course not. I just had favorite stories and favorite characters I wanted to be like. But as I grew, I was in public school. There's a lot that I dislike about public education, but I will say that in my upper years, I always had one teacher who kind of saw me as a person and would come alongside and really encourage something about me, kind of picking up that there wasn't a lot of that at home. And I'm really grateful for that influence each year. And so with that love of story was kind of channeled into a love of history. So when I did go to college, I studied history, which definitely helps with that love of reading and studying old ideas and old books. But I actually, at the end of my high school years, came to faith. So that happened as I was transitioning into college. I ended up going to a Christian school called Grove City, which is a small liberal arts college in Western PA. And there, that was my first taste of a lot of liberal arts and classical ed and reading literature in a particular way and allowing it, more learning to sit under it, not master it, which is kind of the muscle I had from public school was I'm in charge here. I'm going to take this and use it, spit it back out, move on, prove something here, as opposed to this whole harmonious whole is God's world. And the things in it reflect his love to us and teach us about his design for things. And we must learn to submit to it and delight in it. Like that's really kind of the heartbeat of reading and classical education. And so I learned a lot of that in undergrad and kept my love of stories. And you could always find me reading a book that I wasn't supposed to be reading because I just loved reading. All of my roommates were English majors, so they had the best books that they were reading. And it just kind of continued. But then I took kind of a break from reading after school. And I do think this is important because I focused heavily on just practical theology reads, which like a lot of doctrinal stuff, good things to be reading, but I completely avoided reading anything that might feed other parts of me. Not intentionally, it just kind of happens. You know, you can get in these reading ruts where you're like, all I read is this. I think it's really important. And it was reading Narnia, to bring it all back to the Chronicles of Narnia. When my oldest was probably about 2, I was pre-reading for her, thinking they were children's books. And I completely came through the wardrobe in that sense and realized, oh, God speaks to all parts of the image bearer through stories. He does it in scripture too. It's not just instruction or history, it's poetry and prose, and it's narrative, it's story, it's parables. He speaks to all of us in scripture, and so we have to feed that pattern with our reading. And I picked back up all the old classics and literature that I used to love, but had stopped reading. And thankfully, I've been able to do it with my kids. So that's the long version.
That's what we want. That's what we want is the long version. And I can totally relate to that because, I mean, you seem to me like a very driven, like you have your goals type of person. And I relate to that where we can sometimes get too practical and we start to think, oh, okay, well, I'm going to read all the practical stuff because the other stuff maybe is a waste of time. And so what I hear you saying is you understood that, oh, none of all this extra reading, it's not a waste of time. It's also feeding different parts of me. And I just think that's really powerful. I think our listeners, I would want to encourage them to hear that part because I think it's so important. And I think especially as moms, we can really be just driven by the practical side of life and other parts of us kind of wither up because we aren't feeding them.
Yeah, it makes me think of, Katie and I, we're entrepreneurial. You mentioned you and your husband are entrepreneurial. And for the first 3 or 4 years of our marriage, like every day, Amazon was giving us a business book or a self-development book or a, finance book or, some sort of nonfiction, self-development, business very practical, tactical book. And boy, am I grateful for those. Like when we've learned so much from them. And it wasn't until a few years ago. And it's funny because at that time, my idea of fiction was like Tom Clancy. So it's like, okay, well, I'll read like the Bible, business books and Tom Clancy. And that's what I had. And then as we started, and Katie's always had a love for good literature, but I was talking to a friend maybe 2 or 3 years back, and I asked them what they enjoyed reading. And they go, well, I only read nonfiction because I want to make sure I get something out of it if I'm going to take the time to read. And I was like blown away with that statement. I was like, you want to make, like, there's nothing to get, there's nothing to gain from fiction. And I think that's a common sentiment towards fiction, is saying like, well, it's just story. What good is this going to do to my practical life? What am I going to see lived out how's this going to change my life? And speaking to that, how do you feel like you were trained to do that? And how are you doing that with your children? Because again, I grew up, my parents were great. I read, Dickens, and I read C.S. Lewis. And I just remember being depressed, obviously, when I'd read Dickens and be like, well, boy, like there's nothing to gain from this. And then thinking that C.S. Lewis was so, it was fantasy. I'm like, how am I supposed to relate this to my life? So how do you do that? How do you kind of show your children, like, you're living a story as well? There are things to pull from this.
Yeah. So to loop in Charlotte Mason here, because she's always so helpful, she has these 3 instruments of education. And the idea is that you only have these 3 to rightly motivate or educate a child. And they are atmosphere, discipline, and life. And what she means by atmosphere is, of course, the things around them materially, but also the feel of your home, the things that mom and dad actually love. What comes out of your mouths and your fingertips? How do you order your day? What do you show is important by the way you spend your money, spend your time, things like that. Discipline, it's habits, and ideas, or life is ideas. And so what are the ideas you bring into your home? This could be through the books you read, could be through the podcasts you're playing, the conversations you have, the friends, things like that. But these things are what rightly motivate a child. And so when we think about reading and story, we need to consider how we bring it into those 3 instruments and vice versa. So for me particularly, what am I doing in my life? So I had to unlearn the public school habit of I read to assess, to get beyond, which is basically reading for the test, right? You understand how to take a test, how to prove that you know it well enough to move on, and then you totally forget it because you just crammed it in as head knowledge. I had to unlearn that muscle, that actually some things take time. Engaging with ideas takes time. You could read a book, not understand it. To your point of being like, what's the point of me reading this Dickens novel? You might actually land there when you finish reading A Christmas Carol. Be like, well, it was a Christmas story. I guess that's why we read it. And then you read it in 3 years' time and you're like, oh, wow, this is about virtue. This is about love of neighbor. This is about festivity. And then you think, do my children need festivity? Of course they need festivity. They're whole people. They have the tripartite soul that we talk about in classical ed, which means that they are rational. We have a mind, but they're spirited and they're repetitive. And the reason why I think this is important to answer this question is that we in the modern world tend to assume we're just rational. So I read a book and I understand it with my head. And that's how I read. But actually, you are not a brain on a stick. You are primarily driven by your imagination. And we don't usually think this anymore because we think if I have the right answer, I know the right thing to do. And the most important thing for me to give to my kids is the right answer. But how often do we know the right thing in our heads and we don't do it? Because we don't love the right thing yet. And so with story, we enter this magical world where we pull in the rational and the spirited or the chest, the thing that loves, which is actually the driving force in life. And so when I think about the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of the world or kingdom of self or anything else, if you were to be in a kingdom and you were to try to grab the allegiance of a child, would you do it through facts and figures, or would you do it through giving them a picture of a good life? And then our job as parents is to say, is this the real good life or is it not, right? So when we look at something like the Chronicles of Narnia, we fall in love with a great lion who's a little bit scary, but is always good. Kids going on adventures, fighting against evil. And the evil is very clear in a story. This is the bad guy. No one is confused. C.S. Lewis would actually say the stories given in our modern world, like maybe what we see on Instagram or TikTok these days, those are confusing. You don't know which way is heads or tails, who's good, who's not. That whole world is very confusing, but in a fairy tale, in Narnia, and something like that, every child knows. These are the good guys, these are the bad guys. And you build out this understanding of what is the good life. It's laying down your life for others. It's serving beyond yourself. It's aiming for something called virtue that sparkles and glitters. You could sit with your kids and tell them that. Like, let's do ethics flashcards. And it's going to go in and they might recite it back to you, but will they love it? No, but they will love that lion. They will love Aslan. He will stay with them. That picture of a good king worthy to follow into battle will transform what they think is good, and they'll love and pursue it. And story has the ability to do that, but only if you're willing to come in and sit under and be humble and let the story work on you. So with kids, like with my kids, the second part of that question, I don't necessarily sit down and say, this is the point of the silver chair. It's a very scary story about modern enchantments. This is what you need to know about Puddleglum, and this is what you need to know about Jill. No, we read it, and then I give them the tools to play it. They have swords, and they have capes, and they have a lot of time out of doors. And then I use the language. Back to your point, Elijah, about using wardrobe language in our home. We say, don't be used to scrub when kids have bad attitudes. We bring it into our words, we bring it into our play, we bring it into our discipline talk. We talk a lot about dragons in our house because dragons are real. We learn to see them in stories so we can learn to recognize them here. They just look different in our world. But a child becomes familiar with the concept through a story, and then they're able to make sense of this world, move in this world in a way that touches all parts of them, not just a bunch of rules given to them.
Wow. So as I hear you saying this, you talk about falling through that classical wardrobe. And when you say classical, a bunch of different things are going to pop into different people's minds, right? And so you really helped me actually break apart the classical education and separate that from neoclassical education. And so for our listeners, how, and I'm curious on this too, how did you settle on the Charlotte Mason philosophy and be like, I'm going to land here when there are a lot of different, I put in air quotes here, classical options when someone starts looking into a classical education for their children?
Yeah, this is a great question. And you're exactly right. It's hard to understand classical because there isn't one single working definition that everyone agrees on. And that's really hard when you Google what is classical ed and you don't know kind of which way is up or down because you're just hit with everyone's opinion. And how are you supposed to know? So I really feel for people when they do this. The definition that I like and the one that I usually stick with is that classical education seeks to cultivate virtue and wisdom by nourishing a person on what is true, good, and beautiful. And that's very simple intentionally so that it can catch the spirit of almost 2,500 years of conversation. So classical education has its roots in ancient Greece, and it's been happening ever since. And so that means you're going to have people who agree and disagree, and they fight, and they don't like how this one assesses, and that can get really confusing. But overall, there are characteristics to classical education that you should be looking for. And the three questions that I found to be the most helpful and how I looped Mason in are, what is a person? How are we formed? And to what end ought we aim? And I think these are helpful because everything has a telos, which is kind of a philosophical word for an end, like a reason for existence. Your children have them, you as a person have them, and education has one. And classically, the telos of your education should match the telos of your personhood. And that is ultimately, we hope for our children, communion with God. That's why they exist. But on this side of heaven, it's going to look like a virtuous life, working in the direction of imitating Christ, who is the perfect person. And so when you look at curriculum options, when you consider if Charlotte Mason is classical or not, if you ask, what is a person? We have an answer from scripture. We know how God would answer these questions. And so then you look and see, does this answer the same way? And that's kind of my way of figuring out, is this actually classical or not? How do they answer this question? If they say that children exist for the future global economy, they get tossed in my book. That's a neoclassical answer that is not at all what a child exists for. That's like very low-hanging fruit to get a job. That's not why we educate. But if you look at someone like Charlotte Mason, who believes in a whole-souled person, who loves God and neighbor, who acts virtuously and moves in the world in a meaningful way, yeah, that's the same answer. If you ask how are they formed, and she gets into full ideas, narrative form, narration, all of these things, you're like, yeah, that's classical. And then to what end ought we aim is, of course, this end towards God. Then yeah, Mason again fits. And so I'm not a solo Mason, like Mason only ever, because I would be worried personally about following one person who is fallible without any other bounds to her. But when you put her in the stream of classical ed, you find how much she overlaps with others. And I personally feel a lot of confidence following this long conversation and seeing how people have continued to try and pursue God and to honor him in educating children, and finding her there makes me feel really good about it.
Yeah, no, I know. I appreciate that breakdown, I guess, because a lot of times, yeah, you really helped me clarify when I was looking into classical education and just being like, okay, how does this all fit together? So you have a community. Could you tell us a little bit about that too? Because I've been a part of this community. It's incredible. And I would love our listeners to just kind of know a little bit more about what it is that you do.
Well, thanks for asking. Yeah, so it's called Common House. I use the word common in a lot of my things, and that's intentional. One, to encourage women that if they feel like they've come into the classical world and this must just be for another type of family, like someone way smarter who wants to read Plato on Friday, it's not. It is for all moms, because truth, goodness, and beauty actually are what all persons deserve as their birthright. Being made in the image of God means these are the things that nourish you. And so I use common to remind us all that we are actually capable of bringing this into our home to our children, and we are the women to do this. It's okay if you don't feel very classical. And so Common House is where I can teach further. I say it's for the mother teacher who wants to go further up and further in, because yes, everything that I have is from C.S. Lewis, and you will catch all of the references throughout my work. But it's where I'm able to teach in long form. I really believe in the form of education, whether it be for children or for mothers, and I don't like short form. I'm not a big fan of social media. I'm not a big fan of quick sound bites or just facts without their informing ideas. And so even in my own work to moms, I try to honor their personhood by teaching them in a way that fits that form. So we have long form courses. Right now we are doing classical virtues and vices. So looking at the larger conversation around those and how Christians have understood them historically and also imparted them to their children or warned them if it's vice. And we also have a lot of other resources. So basically it's a place to get your educational, philosophical muscles in check, because again, to your point earlier, philosophy used to be very practical. Now we have the image of old guys sitting in libraries and they're really smart and no one understands them, but philosophy is the love of wisdom. And so if we can pattern our lives after wisdom and put practices in place that aren't prescriptive, it's not come copy the things at the Kern house, because that serves no one. They're philosophical and principle oriented, because those, I believe, are freeing for mothers. So you equip them with philosophy, then they can take any book they find and teach it a Mason way, teach it a classical way. They're not beholden to following a particular person, which I think is important.
Yeah, that is important. And you brought up a point too. I'm just going to jump in here one more time.
By all means, jump in.
No, but you brought up that long form content, which is something that we've really felt called to as well. And I'm curious, you mentioned in a couple of the videos that I was watching, you took a break from your smartphone. How could you tell us a little bit about that experience? Because we currently have dumb phones, and a lot of our audience has transitioned to that too, but I think it's helpful for them to hear about someone else's experience, different background, different life, different family. How's that journey been for you?
Yeah. So I think like a lot of people, I was breaking up with my smartphone for a long time. You kind of realize, oh, maybe I'm on Instagram too much, and you start pulling back from certain apps, and then you're like, oh, maybe I don't want to email on my phone. I don't want to be accessible all the time. Can I get comfortable with not being accessible in the modern age? With my husband, Josh, he's so comfortable with things like that. Like, no, you should not be able to get a hold of me in 24 hours. This blows my mind. I think it's the homeschooler in him. He does not feel the need to conform to useless things like that. He's just like, that's not a thing we have to do. And so I'm always so encouraged by his example. But I was slowly breaking up with the phone. And then a little over a year ago, it was just fever pitch one day. I was like, I don't need this and I'm going to get rid of it. And so I ran to the store and grabbed the $20 option for a flip phone for my plan, like for AT&T. And so it's been over a year. I think I decided maybe 3 months in that I wasn't going back. Like I knew this is a good thing. I'm not going to do this. And when I started, I had these questions. And so I started this series called the Dumb Phone series, or Living Like a Human, I was calling it on YouTube. And my 2 questions were, are we cultivating a love for convenience with these smartphones in a way that actually make us prefer machines to people? That was the first part. And the second was, are we cultivating the lie of old that we're like God in ways that we're not? Primarily that we think we're omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent with the smartphone. And my question, or my answer to both, was yes to both. And I had fun side tangents like, are we becoming modern Gnostics because we prefer, or we think all important things happen online in the world of ideas, not in the embodied world in which most mothers live? Like we have smartphones in our back pockets, but we have to deal with people. Like we have to serve people. We're very fleshy types of life, honestly, as moms of young kids. And I wondered if everything being easy on your phone, your life not wanting to have any small sufferings, everything being convenient, if that actually made your interactions with your young children harder, because people aren't convenient. Love is inconvenient. And so if we're cultivating constantly, what can I hook to my iPhone? What kind of watch can I wear? What kind of glasses can I wear? Everything's moving towards my phone, controlled by my phone, even like the heat in my house is on my phone. Then people become kind of icky to us. And E.M. Forster has the short story called The Machine Stops. It's terrifying. I highly encourage everyone to read it, in which people sit in these pods all day. they come online and they give their talks and they talk about ideas. And basically the body becomes something you have to care for, like an obnoxious house. Like you have to care for it because you live in it. But people are gross. When the character has to go around other people, they like don't like the smells and the sounds of people swallowing, and like you get kind of icky about people. So I wondered if that would happen, and I think we're not there yet, but we're moving that direction. And then I do think the ability to see what everyone's eating online, the ability to do everything online, to be updated on news online, makes you feel like you know things, you know everything, you're everywhere in a way that's actually pretty damaging. And so I started this idea of limitations with the dumb phone. It was really nice for me to tell the kids, no, you can't listen to that song. Not because mom arbitrarily says no, but we just live a life of limitations, which is what it's like to be a person. You're limited by God's design, and that's a good thing. And in the modern age where we have a lot of privileges and a lot of opportunities to extend beyond those limitations, I think now the question is how are we as Christians going to honor that and live within them?
Wow. That is awesome. There is so much depth to that decision, and a couple things that stood out to me. I forget how you phrased it, but talking about almost like not seeing a need for God when we're dependent on this technology. And I even think of people taking the time to prepare a meal, at home versus just ordering via Uber Eats or just doing takeout. And you start thinking about where the groceries are coming from. You're like, okay, wait a second, where was this raised? Oh man. Then you're preparing it. And I think when you go through that, you almost get to a place of worship because you're like, man, the Lord provides this. How dependent we are upon the Lord for our physical provision. And you talked about the climate in your home, just like hitting a button on your phone versus like if you're in you have to like start a fire, in your wood stove, and and I'm not saying you have to do this in order to have this appreciation for the Lord, but I do think a lot of these things can facilitate this reality of our human limitations, which should bring us to a place of, dependency on the Lord, being like, wow, like, thank you, Lord. That theology perspective of a high view of God and a low view of man. And I really do think that these practical things can facilitate that mindset. But you have to be, it's pretty bizarre that you have to be proactive to do it. You're like, I have to actually like slow down. I have to acknowledge the human limitations, versus lying to myself and thinking I am, omnipresent, and I can access anything all the time. So that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, I'm curious, did anything take you off guard? Was it totally seamless? Like you just kind of dumbed your smartphone down enough so it wasn't a big jump for you? Or were there some things where it's like, okay, this is really frustrating, but then you kind of found a new groove?
I think for me personally, getting rid of the phone wasn't a huge issue. I remember life before the smartphone. I think I talked about this in some of my videos. Like I lived abroad internationally without a smartphone. So I had certain muscles that I don't know everyone cultivated before the iPhone came about, because I could remember how to print off a map or write down directions and get lost and not freak out, which actually are things that can cause anxiety for people these days. But I did not anticipate some of the reactions I would get from strangers. So had I needed to ask for directions, people don't know their places anymore. People couldn't give me directions. They would be like, well, don't you have a smartphone? I actually had an older woman, someone pushing 70, 75 laugh at me when I said, well, I don't have a smartphone. I mean, she just thought this was outrageous. And so I didn't really anticipate those reactions from people to find me, again, to be an annoyance, to be inconvenient, to be asking for directions. But also I feel like when we lose our sense of place, that's a worrisome thing as people. Like it comes from humus, which means earth person. Like we're earth people. We're actually made for a place. We were made for a garden. We're going to be made for the new heavens and the new earth. Place really matters. And we're divorcing ourselves. Again, this idea of divorcing ourselves from full reality, I think it's easier with the iPhone. And even when we think about the practices in our home, Elijah, you were talking about like when you know where your food comes from and you're cooking it, we also have the danger in the modern world of separating ideas from the embodied action. Like you do live out your ideas. I always say that if you have virtue in your head, it's not virtue. If the things you believe and the ideals you're holding to in your mind aren't worked out of your fingertips, you're missing a huge part of it. You live out these ideas, which is really important. But I would like to add, I have a video coming out soonish. It's the dark side of the dumb phone. And I started to notice in conversations that women had a lot of reasons for why in their families, their husbands were saying, I don't really want you to get rid of your smartphone. They were listening to me. They probably were listening. I know you guys have the dumb phones, other people like me, and feeling really encouraged, but then hitting some sort of circumstantial thing. Either they move a lot because they're military, or they get lost a lot and they keep in touch with family and friends around the world. And that would, kind of hurt those relationships, things that were valid. And so I wanted to make the point that these principles, again, could be applied with a smartphone, but you're going to be working a totally different set of muscles. It is a lot harder to never download your email app on a smartphone than it is to just not have the option to do it. You have to work on another set of muscles. And so for maybe the woman or maybe couples listen to your podcast who feel like, oh, I really can't do this. I need two-factor authentication for work, which is one of my friends. He needs that. He cannot get in to his job every morning without it. There are other ways to pursue, again, the life-giving principle that we're trying to pursue here. It might just look in a slightly different form, but the limitation is the thing we need, even if it can't look exactly like maybe the way the three of us have done it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, that's good.
I appreciate you pointing that out, because I do think, like you said, not only you can miss, you can get lost in like what the goal was in the first place. You're like, wait a second here, there is a bigger goal. I'm curious, you've mentioned your husband Josh a few times. You're both entrepreneurial. Your oldest is the same age as our oldest, 7, and we homeschooling was the plan from the get for us. But I'm curious as to like how you would encourage husbands to get on board with classical education in your home with Charlotte Mason, because like I'm an excitable guy. I'd rather get excited than not, and so I was like I like jumping on bandwagons, I should say. And so I'm the type of guy that was like going to jump on the bandwagon with Katie, and she's the same way too. Like that's why we get along with each other. Like we really like jumping on bandwagons. But if there's a husband that maybe is more, I don't even know what the term you would use, more of that engineering type brain. He wants the facts, and he's not necessarily prone to seeing the beauty in literature. What are some words of encouragement so that couples can be on the same page here? Because I tell you what, it's pretty powerful when you're united in this effort in educating your children. So what are some things you've learned and you've been able to see in couples?
Yeah. So ideally, mom and dad are on the same page with this, but realistically, that does not always happen at the same time. And I feel for dads who are working all day outside of the home and their wife has the freedom and the privilege to listen to podcasts and read books. And then he comes home, wants to spend time with the kids, and then does not want to pick up a Victorian English woman's, philosophy of education. I understand this. It's very realistic. It's very ordinary. No woman listening should feel upset or, lack hope about this. So I talk about this a lot, that I think the first and most important thing is respect in this conversation. Absolutely. Your husband loves your children, and that's where you start. Actually, all of classical education is centered around love. That's it. And back to that idea of the imagination and the spirited chest that pulls you in this world. It's based on what you love. And so I encourage the moms that I talk to that if they are wanting to share about classical education, if they're wanting to share about the practices they'd like to bring into their home, to first go humbly to their husbands and actually just share what they themselves are learning and enjoying. It's not a manipulative thing like, hey, by the end of this conversation, I want this, this, and this. It's, I'm actually loving what I just heard on this podcast or I just read in this book, and give the sound bites to it. Give the bits that you can share in conversation, because that's very natural for couples to talk about the things that they're thinking about and enjoying and that they are learning and growing in, but not overhaul the house. That's the other side of it. So you can't just come in and steamroll over your husband if he has zero idea who Charlotte Mason is, or thought that homeschooling was going to be just like an open and go box sort of situation. And you're like, no, we have to get rid of every book we've ever purchased. And actually the kids need all linen dresses and we have to be outside 8 hours a day. Like you do that to him and he's going to hate it. Like he's not going to understand what happened. Last week, this was not a thing. So I always say, come in with true love. What are the 3 things you've learned about that you are loving that you can share in real conversation? Because ideas, Charlotte Mason describes ideas like creepy little things. They seize you, they take hold of you, they catch you. I mean, they're verbs. They come in, and the mind is a spiritual thing and ideas are a spiritual thing. And so when you give your husband ideas, the things you are truly loving, and give him time, he will have time to think about them, engage with them, and also watch your children flourish. I think one of the best things that mom does is you're the lady of the house. You probably are the boots on the ground, right? And so every day you're doing the read aloud. You're having the tea time. You've taught your children some lovely poetry. You're working on good habits so that your house is hospitable to everyone who lives in it and those who come in it. Your husband will notice those things too. So part of it is sharing ideas. Part of it is just doing the work with your kids and letting that speak for itself. And then depending on your husband, there are a couple things you can do. If you have a husband who's a researcher, big bandwagon guy, perhaps, then you can be like, hey, I listen to this podcast. Will you listen to it? Or, hey, I want to read this book together. Or, hey, I just dog-eared a couple of pages in this chapter I read. Can you read those? I want to talk about them. If your husband's not a reader, which I actually hear quite a lot of from women, then again, you go with, hey, I want to go on a hike this weekend. Do you want to come with us? It's an invitation. Do you want to come into this practice? Do you want to join us in this thing? And then, I mean, ultimately, hopefully what every mom is, I think, hoping for is that you have the teammateship. And you mentioned Josh. Yeah, the way it works for us is he's my big vision guy. He jokes that I'm Josh 2.0. So he's like, let's homeschool. And I'm like, I'm going to make it my entire life. I'm going to do it so hard. And so I'm Josh 2.0. And that works. He trusts me, like boots on the ground. Autumn's got this. She's smart. She's working hard. I trust her what she's doing with the kids. I will step in where I can, but I'm the vision guy. Autumn's practical. Other people are going to be like, we're equally vision and we need help with practical, or we're super practical and we don't know where our vision is. So it's really not going to be something you can copy and paste from anyone that you follow online, but it is going to be, again, through sharing the ideas, sharing the habits, and then letting the atmosphere of your home reflect the goodness and harmonious whole of God's world back to the people in it.
I love just how we're laughing, because that's been like our last week. That's like our life, but it's also been our last week where Elisha mentioned a couple ideas. And then I've been like getting up at 4 and staying up till midnight trying to enact these ideas. She's like, wow, I didn't realize how intense you were.
She commits her life to it. Just kind of like, well, you got a tattoo already? Like it was just an idea, like,
yeah. My husband learned not to just kind of unintentionally, flippantly throw out an idea, because he comes back and like, well, I wrote out a Google document. You will see it's color coded and waiting for you on your pillow. Yeah, exactly.
That is so fun. Oh my goodness. Okay. But there was something else I was going to say to that. And then I just totally blanked. But anyways.
Okay. Well, maybe you'll get it. We were talking before.
Oh,
go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I got it. But I was just thinking, you can tell that your philosophy for life is so rooted in scripture and in incredible people who back up scripture and give it more depth and variance and practicality in our life, because you just have so much respect in the way you speak for personhood. And you see that in the way that you view your children, and the way that you view yourself as a whole person, and the way that you view your husband. And I think that's something that we're really lacking in our culture today. It's just respect for people and that value. And so I just think we as women too can just get better and better and better at growing and seeing respect for people. And I think we're going to be a lot more successful in communicating with our husbands and in passing things on to our children and in being these living, flourishing beings within our home, just by doing that, with nothing else changing. So I just think that's a really interesting point. But
yeah, that is powerful. Especially, like you said, it is kind of bizarre within our culture how the elevation and the idolization of the individual has really been detrimental to personhood. Where it's like, man, when you think that we are the supreme, like our decision is what matters. Whereas when you actually see yourself in the order that God has created, with Him being the supreme, Him being over all things, and then His created order, having just that in order, it's like that's when the personhood actually thrives and you're able to see it for what its intended purpose was. We were talking before, you've got a new season in your podcast coming out, and Katie and I were both like, whoa, we are pumped about it. So I don't know if you could give a little sneak peek as to what this is going to look like and what the timing of this is for, could you share that to our listeners?
Sure, absolutely. So we start on, I believe it's March 7th with the season trailer kind of opener. But this is our 4th season and it is called Storied Souls. And so I am trying to answer the questions that a classical mother teacher has about story when she comes through the wardrobe. Because story is not one of the hard things to sell to a mom. Like, you need to read your kids good stories. But then all of a sudden things get weird. Like, am I supposed to read this Grimm's fairy tale to them before bedtime? Why is it so dark and creepy? What am I supposed to do with this very long story when I have young kids? How do I know if they understand it? Why do we have to read these stories? That's a really common one. Why is the classics list this list? Why can't I read other things? Who says these are the best? And so you have all of these questions that come up once you get into classical education. And I wanted to spend an entire season talking about it because stories are so formative. And so this, usually I'm a solo podcast gal, but this season I'm going to have interviews for every single question. And so I was really grateful to talk to educators, philosophers, writers, artists about a different question about story for each episode. And so that will be coming out right now on YouTube is the season trailer, which my brother-in-law, Sam, is a very talented filmmaker and made for us. And my sweet Josh, who comes up again, dragged a wardrobe out into the woods for me so that my kids could literally go through it.
Wow.
I hope wardrobe is a core memory for these children. Like if nothing else, going through a wardrobe should be a core memory for these kids.
Yeah, I don't think you have no worries there. I don't think it's ever going to get out of their brain. Yeah, at this point.
Either
yeah.
that or just like the stink of the thrift store fur jackets that we were hanging in it. I don't know
Nice,
which
yeah.
one hit them in the face more in the moment, but we have a whole trailer about what is the power of a mother with words. And the question I'm throwing back at my audience is, are you going to build worlds with your words? Because that's the power of a mother at home. You can teach your children from the very start how this world is ordered. Back to your point about ordering things. Yeah, we live in a time of expressive individualism, and that is helping no one. And yet it's because it's a disordered way of living in right orders of loves. This ordo amoris, which is what is in Latin, St. Augustine called it, is the part of virtue. It's part of growing. Only God can withstand the weight of your happiness. And happiness classically is the habitual action of pursuing virtue. That's what that used to mean. Can you believe that? Being happy is what that used to mean. And
The habitual action of pursuing virtue.
habitual action of pursuing virtue.
Wow.
No way.
Dude, let's bring happy back. I tell you what. Yeah.
I remember when it was not cool to say that you wanted your kids to grow up and be happy. It was like a no-no in the Christian world. Holy, yes. Happy, definitely not. But happiness, actually, classically, yeah, because you go through this entire flow chart of, well, what makes you happy? What is man? What can take care of the soul? And you just end at God. And God is the only one who can withstand the weight of your happiness, and everything else has to order from there. I love my husband more than I love a cup of coffee. If I put the cup of coffee before the husband, the whole thing falls apart. And we realize that when we put ourselves at the top of the pinnacle with this high view of the individual and yet not of the person. And so all of that comes into story because through story, you teach your children this right place in the cosmos. And there's where you'll thrive and actually enjoy this experience in God's world.
Whoa. That is,
Yeah, just mic drop us in there.
yeah, that's awesome. So good. Wow. Well, Autumn, once again, thank you so much. I'm so fired up. This is inspirational.
I know. Elisha's like, who's this gal? Like, she's going to talk about homeschooling. I was like, you're really going to like her. Like, she really inspires me.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, for taking your time, having a quiet room to be able to film. And where can our listeners find more of you? Because I know that if they haven't already found more of you, they are going to want to.
Oh, thanks so much. So the Commonplace, you can find it on any place that you tune into podcasts. You'll find me there. Also, I am on YouTube under the Commonplace. It's where I make my Common Mom videos. So still philosophy, but I usually have a bit more of a jovial, convivial spirit. They're a little more funny. And then Common House is where we continue learning together, which you can find at commonhouse.mn.co.
Awesome.
Wow.
We will have that all linked in the description box. And thank you again so much,
Yeah.
Autumn.
Thank you, Autumn. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.